Lantern Church, it is a delight to be with you this morning. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you and be part of your Creation Care series. I'm sorry I'm not with you in person, but do know that I am praying for you as you gather in person. I'm Jack, I'm a campaigner at Tearfund, and if you don't know Tearfund, we are a Christian relief and development charity working in over 50 different countries and passionate about supporting the local church to see their communities lifted out of poverty and able to reach their God-given potential. So this morning we are thinking practically about how we can each play our part as disciples of Jesus, to love our neighbours and to care for his creation. And to help us with that, we are diving into the story of the Good Samaritan, a classic when it comes to working out what it means to live justly and love mercy. I love this story, but I also find it deeply uncomfortable. As I read the story, I wonder, where would I be in this narrative? Which of these characters am I most like? As I think about poverty and injustice in the world today, I wonder, how does my response match up to the Samaritan? Jesus tells this story to a whole bunch of religious leaders, and he makes it very clear where they fit in this story. Jesus first picks on the priests, the religious leaders. They see the injured man and then they rush by in a hurry. Perhaps they're running really late to a staff meeting, or they're meant to be live streaming the next service. They don't have time to care for the poor. They're too busy with their religious duties. Next up comes the Levites, or temple assistants, the life group leaders of their day. And they really need to get stuff ready for this week's gathering, to make sure all the questions are sorted and discussion prompts are ready. So they hurry on by too. There's no time to offer mercy to this man in the ditch. And then comes the unexpected member of the story, the Samaritan, a group of people despised by those listening to Jesus. The Samaritans were the outcasts, the rejects, the people with dodgy theology. And this Samaritan sees the victim in the ditch. And despite probably on his way to doing many different things, a busy day ahead, a journey to finish, he stops, allows himself to be interrupted, and bandages this man's wounds, making sure he gets to safety and covering the cost for his accommodation and any bills that might come. Jesus makes it very clear to those listening, whatever their excuses were, the first two failed to make time for what really mattered to God. Jesus' story of the Samaritan is a response to the question of what it means to truly love God and love our neighbour. The two commandments that sum up all of the law, and this is the story that Jesus offers to illustrate what that looks like. So if we want to learn what it looks like to worship God with everything we've got, this is a great story to begin with. The Samaritan saw a victim of injustice and allowed himself to be interrupted. He saw a crisis and put his faith into action, choosing to be inconvenienced and to give himself, his time, his resources in order to care for someone who urgently needed it. And in doing so, he not only modelled what it is to love his neighbour, but also what it is to love God too. It was me who needed clothes, and you clothed me, says Jesus in Matthew 25. It was me who was hungry, and you fed me. It was me who was thirsty. It was me who you came to support, says Jesus. Jesus tells his disciples that to love our neighbours and to care for the poor is to love Jesus himself. This is what worship looks like. But we're in the middle of a series on creation care, and this story doesn't mention anything about creation. So what are we doing this morning? I want us to focus on how the way we've damaged God's creation is not just a stewardship issue, as important as that is, but this is a huge issue of justice. It is the poorest who are being impacted first and worst by our failure to care for God's creation. And as Christians who are called to love our neighbours, this is not something we can sit out. This is not something we can walk on by. We are now starting to see the impacts of climate change close to home, with record weather events and temperatures becoming our new normal. But as the climate crisis accelerates, its impacts are far greater for those living in poverty. They're already facing the most severe consequences. We're seeing storms become more powerful. We're seeing droughts and floods becoming more severe, all of which destroy people's homes, food and communities. It's thought that someone is displaced by climate change or a weather-related disaster every single second of every day. And when people's homes are destroyed, or as rising sea levels force them to relocate, they become refugees, vulnerable to trafficking or abuse, or unable to be all that God intended for them. In May, while we were living through the driest May on record in the UK, there was the largest ever cyclone recorded in the Indian Ocean, Cyclone Amphan, and it hit the coasts of Bangladesh and India. And as it struck, it destroyed homes, communities, and left 14 million people without power. And it also hit the camps where the Rohingya refugees had been taking shelter. This was quickly followed by some of the worst monsoon rains on record, and we saw a third of Bangladesh, a whole third of the country, submerged underwater. The climate crisis is having a huge impact already on the poorest people in the world. And these big disastrous events are clear signs for us to look to. But it's the more subtle and continuous impacts of the climate crisis which are having an even bigger impact on the world's poorest. Last year, a colleague of mine was in Ethiopia and they met a woman called Orbisa. Now, Orbisa lives in a rural part of the country with her children and her family, rearing goats and cattle. Over the last few years, the rainfall has become less and less reliable because of climate change. My colleague asked Orbisa about her experience of the last few years, and this is what she said. In the past, we had rainfall every 6 months, but now we just don't know when the rainfall will come. The length of the dry season is increasing, and my animals are dying. As her animals die, this means she has less income, they have less food, and they can't support their family. Because of the lack of rain, she also has to travel for hours to try and find clean water for her children, and they often go to bed thirsty. For people in poverty, the climate crisis is not some distant or theoretical or scientific threat. It is a terrifying reality that they are already living in. This is a justice issue, not only because it's people in poverty who are impacted, but because these are the people who have done the least to cause it. In less than a fortnight, the average Briton's emissions will have overtaken what someone in Malawi emits in a whole year. The inequality of who is causing this crisis is unbelievable. So not only is climate change hitting people in poverty, but they have done the least to cause it. It is a crisis caused by the way that our society and economy works, the way that we live and eat and travel and enjoy all the comforts of modern life. And to make it worse, we are failing to act with the urgency that this requires. There's loads of numbers thrown around with climate change, but if you remember one thing this morning, I want you to remember 1.5. So if you remember one thing, remember 1.5. Scientists have said that we have to limit global warming, the average temperatures, from increasing by 1.5 degrees Celsius as an average all around the world, for the best chance of avoiding runaway climate breakdown, where we see things spiralling out of control. It doesn't sound like much, 1.5 degrees, but the further we go over that, the worse the impacts will be, especially on the poorest people. So to give you some context for that, just the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, half a degree more of warming, would be huge. So just that small difference, that extra half a degree, would likely see droughts lasting twice as long. We would see more than 100 million more people struggling to access clean water. And we'd see 12 million more people flooded in coastal areas. To love our global neighbours, we have to do all we can to limit to 1.5 degrees. But we've already heated the planet by 1.1 degrees, and we are fast running out of time. Global emissions are continuing to rise, and we are on track for about 3 to 4 degrees of warming in my lifetime, which would be catastrophic. This is why people now talk about a climate emergency. The need for action is urgent and it is huge, and we need an emergency response to get back on track. So why are we talking about the Good Samaritan when we're talking about climate change? Because this is a huge issue of justice. And it is a challenge for us as the church to work out what it means to love the God of all creation and to love our neighbours in a time of global crisis. I want to say, if we are to truly love our global neighbours today, we have to tackle this climate crisis and give it everything we've got. As Christians, we simply cannot walk by and hope someone else comes by after us. To return to the Good Samaritan, he sees someone suffering and in crisis. He could have walked by, hoping someone else would help, but instead he chooses to be interrupted. He chooses to have his life and his day change direction in order to serve his neighbour. Will we choose to be interrupted when we see this crisis? But this interruption is also an opportunity for us to worship. The Good Samaritan modelled what it was, not just to care for someone who was suffering, but to love and worship God. In Romans 12, Paul writes, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." We can choose to offer our bodies, our lives, every decision we make as a sacrifice and as an act of worship to God. To offer every decision we make, from the most mundane decisions in the supermarket to the plans for the year ahead, all of it can be offered as an offering of worship to the God who loves justice and the God who calls us to love our neighbours. And what a joy it is to worship God with everything that we've got. In my flat in London, we've switched to renewable energy, and it feels like an act of worship every time I turn on the lights and thank God for the wind and the waves that power our home. I've stopped flying and I cycle a lot more to reduce my emissions. I've cut down how much meat I eat as well. And last year I took on a huge challenge to reduce my plastic waste down to a small jar of rubbish. Plastic pollution has a huge impact on people in poverty and on the environment. And so I reduced my landfill waste down to just this jar for the year, for the whole of 2019, all of my landfill waste. It's an extreme example, but as Christians we are called to be people who model a different way. People who don't just conform to the broken patterns of this world, but point people to the God of justice, the God of all creation, who join him in praying and acting to see the kingdom come. There's so much we can do to be interrupted, to break out of the broken patterns of this world, and to worship God with all that we've got. And this morning I want to invite you to think about 3 ways of doing that. How you power your home, what you eat, and how you travel. So first, switching to renewable electricity is a one-off thing. It is pretty easy to do, and it has a lasting impact. Switching to renewables means that you are investing in green power that doesn't contribute to the climate crisis. If you head to bigcleanswitch.org/Tearfund, you're able to find your cheapest 100% renewable electricity provider and make an easy switch for your home. Could you reduce how much meat you eat and shift to a more plant-based diet? Being a vegan reduces your carbon footprint significantly, but if you can't jump there straight away, think about how you can reduce your meat consumption. So I eat a mostly vegetarian diet now. I'm trying to reduce my dairy, and I'm saving meat for special occasions and celebrations. A chance to really thank God for the food that I've got and reduce my emissions in the process. So how can you change the way you eat to shift away from red meat like beef and lamb and move more towards a plant-based diet to reduce your impact? And how about how you travel as well? So if you are someone who flew regularly before the pandemic, if you stopped flying, that would be the biggest thing you could do to reduce your emissions. And for the rest of us, choosing to cycle or walk more often instead of driving will significantly reduce our impact as well. By the way we power our homes, what we eat and how we travel, we can massively reduce our impact and worship God in the way that we live our everyday lives. So take a moment now to pause and think. How can you love God and love your neighbour through the way that you live? How will you allow God to interrupt you today? If you have decided to be interrupted and to change your way of living, I would love to hear about it. Do tell Fiona or Mike, or find me on social media. I would love to be praying for you as you choose to live in a different way that loves God and loves your neighbour. And now, as a final comment, I just want to think about the causes of the man's suffering in the Good Samaritan story. Jesus begins by explaining that this man was beaten by robbers and left half dead. For people already suffering the worst impacts of the climate crisis, the cause of their suffering is very clear. It's the failure of governments and powerful businesses to act with the urgency required. We've known what's been causing this and the impacts that there would be for a very long time. But our broken economic system, addicted to exploitative growth and rising emissions, is the robber of our Good Samaritan story this morning. And as the church, we are called to love those who are suffering and to help get them on their feet. But we are also called to speak up for those who are not being heard. We must live differently as part of our worship, but we must also recover our prophetic voice and call for change. Call for a world where we get back on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and care for God's creation and love our global neighbours. Right now, we have a huge opportunity to do that, and I want to invite you to join us in this. Governments around the world are working out how to reboot their economies after the lockdowns of this year. And the decisions they make will determine our trajectory for years to come, and will have ripple effects on our climate for a very long time. We can choose to reboot in a way that creates a fairer, more sustainable world, or we can lock in the dangerous and harmful effects of our carbon-addicted economy. So as of next week at Tearfund, we are launching a new campaign, calling on the UK government to help us love our global neighbours by reducing emissions and investing in a fairer, greener future. So keep an eye out for that. Do follow Tearfund on social media and join us in speaking out against what is causing this injustice around the world. So as we end, let me pray for us this morning. God, we thank you for the example that you give us in the Good Samaritan story of someone who radically loves their neighbour and worships you in the process. God, in the face of the climate crisis, would you help us to spot our global neighbours in the stories of extreme weather events and disasters around the world? Would you help us to pray with them and to love them through the way that we live our lives? God, would you interrupt us? Would you break us out of our patterns of living and help us to be people who live in a way that honours you and your creation? And finally, God, would you help us to speak up? Would you help us to challenge the systems and structures that push people deeper into poverty and make the climate crisis worse? God, would you use us to see your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven? In Jesus' name, amen.